spooky friends. Thanks for spending your Friday with us, or whatever day it is that you're listening. There's nothing better than finding a way to connect with fellow true crime-loving weirdos, and that's precisely why we created our own true crime cult.
But don't worry, we're not into any of that sleep deprivation or diet control stuff. You've landed in the only cult with unlimited naps and snacks. Grab a flower crown, cozy up with one of our baby goats, and settle in for another story on the subject that brought us all together, murder. Just because you tune into our show every week, we like to think of you as honorary monsters. But if you want to make it official, you can join the MMN commune on Patreon. Just go to patreon.com/murdermurdernews to sign up, and in return, we'll give you a shout out on the show, name one of our adorable baby goats in your honor, and of course, you'll have exclusive access to our regular patron-only content.
Let's kick things off with a look at some of the true crime stories making headlines this week.
A corrections officer went missing last Friday morning while escorting an inmate to court in Alabama. Assistant Director Vicki White was working her last shift before retirement when she left the detention center alone with inmate Casey White, no relation, at approximately 9:40 a.m. to escort him to the courthouse. Casey White is 38 years old, 6'6", 252 pounds, with brown eyes and brown hair. He was charged with capital murder and the brutal stabbing of 58-year-old Connie Ridgway. Vicki White is 5'5", 160 pounds, and has brown eyes and blonde hair. At first, it seemed like Vicki may have been in danger, but as of Tuesday, an arrest warrant has been issued for her for assisting in the escape. New documents show that there was no court appearance scheduled for Casey White. As well, it seems that just a few weeks ago, Vicki White sold her home in Lexington, Alabama for $95,550, way below market value. A.D. White's patrol vehicle was located in a parking lot in Florence, where surveillance footage shows she drove the escapee. Others incarcerated in Lauderdale County say the pair had a special relationship. The U.S. Marshal Service says the two were last seen in Rogersville in a gold/maybe copper 2007 Ford Edge with Alabama plates and are believed to be armed with an AR-15 and shotgun. If you have any information or have seen Vicki White or Casey White, please call 911.
6-year-old Dominic Keegan of Connecticut was hospitalized this past week after suffering third-degree burns to his face and legs. The boy's older sister says that an older bully soaked a ball in gasoline and set it on fire before launching it at her brother as the two siblings played in the yard outside the apartment building where they lived. Bridgeport officials did not immediately confirm the family's account. Bridgeport's Director of Emergency Management and Homeland Security, Scott Appleby, said in a statement that the incident Sunday was under investigation, but no criminal charges have been announced. Relatives say Dominic is being treated for second and third degree burns at Bridgeport Hospital and is recovering.
We'll be right back after a quick commercial break from one of our favorite Darkcast podcasts.
Hi, this is Molly
and Cody,
the host of Over the Fence True Crime Podcast.
Please join us as we talk about true crime in the most normal place in the world.
Over the fence.
To be specific, over our backyard fence. We're both moms of humans and of dogs. We live directly next door to each other and share many conversations about life and family, but mostly true crime over our backyard fence.
And we invite you to come learn more about true crime and, well, us. We give a lot of attention to California true crime, but have ventured throughout the U.S. and even across the pond and plan to continue our world domination in the near future.
Listen to us wherever you listen to your podcasts, or give us a follow on Instagram at overthefence_podcast. So grab a drink and talk with us.
Over the Fence.
And we're back.
Before we dig in, we want to offer a quick disclaimer. Though we joke about forming a true crime cult, that is not to diminish the severity of actual cult activity, and we want you to know that we take the cases we're discussing very seriously.
We want to deliver each story with the utmost respect to victims and anyone involved. If you feel we've missed the mark, you don't like our tone, or if you notice we've gotten any details wrong, let us know with a quick email to murdermurdernews@gmail.com and we'll make it right. Some specific trigger warnings for this episode include child murder, child sexual assault, torture, and graphic descriptions of violence. If any of those subjects are particularly sensitive for you, you may want to skip this one and listen to one of our other episodes instead.
56 years ago today, Britain's most reviled killers were convicted and received an unprecedented sentence. If you live in the UK, you've most definitely heard of the Moors murders, perpetrated by Ian Brady and Myra Hindley. Being Canadian, I wasn't so familiar, so I took some time to peruse all things Moors murders in hopes of offering a fresh take even to Brits who have steeped in this story for over half a century.
Ian Brady had a pretty rough upbringing. He was born Ian Stewart in Glasgow, Scotland, to a single mother in 1938. No one is really sure who his biological father was, but his mom's story at the time was that he was a newspaper reporter who had passed away just a few months before Ian was born. His mom, Peggy, was a waitress at a tea room. Peggy really struggled to make ends meet, working full-time, even as a new mom. And when Ian was just a few months old, she put him in the care of Mary and John Sloan, a married couple with 4 kids of their own. Ian took their family name and became Ian Sloan. Peggy continued to visit him throughout his childhood, and Ian grew into a gifted student, but a bit of a delinquent. He went to court twice as a young teen after minor break-ins. His first major romantic relationship ended after he threatened his girlfriend with a knife for going to a dance with another guy. This landed Ian in court again, and he was given probation with the condition that he live with his mother. Peggy had moved to Manchester and married an Irish fruit merchant called Patrick Brady. Patrick got Ian a job at the fruit market, and Ian took on his stepfather's surname, becoming Ian Brady. Aside from always being a little rough around the edges and routinely getting into trouble with the law, Brady also had this carefully cultivated image of a too cool loner. While other guys adopted the teddy boy style in the 1950s, Ian preferred a good 3-piece suit. Overdressed, long and lanky, Ian also preferred wide-leg trousers and oversized blazers to the skinny styles at the time. Ian did some self-study in bookkeeping, and in 1959 landed a clerical job at a wholesale chemical distributor.
Ian met his counterpart at work when 18-year-old Myra Hindley was hired as a typist at the same chemical distribution company. Myra Hindley is seemingly even more hated than Ian Brady, which at first sort of rubbed me the wrong way. The impression was like, yeah, sometimes men are murderers, but how could a woman stand by and let it happen? It seemed like there was a bit of misogyny at play, especially considering that Myra may have been manipulated into keeping her lover's secrets, and perhaps she hadn't actually participated in any of the murders. But the more I immersed myself in the case, the more I understood. Myra Hindley grew up in Gorton, a working-class area of Manchester. Her family was poor, and her father was an abusive alcoholic. He was also a World War II veteran, and he stood by his tough guy persona that got him through the war. He wanted his daughters to be tough guys too, always encouraging them to stand up for themselves by hitting bullies back even harder. Once, when a little boy at school scratched Myra's cheeks, she ran home crying to her dad. He told her she'd better march right back out there and retaliate, or she would get a whipping. When she was 5 years old, Myra's little sister Maureen was born, and Myra was sent down the road to live with her grandmother, who she called Granny Maybury. The family was so poor that they had just one bedroom with 2 beds in it, and it seemed to work out okay with one child, but there really wasn't room for another. Though all of this sounds pretty rough, neighbors insisted that there was nothing out of the ordinary about her upbringing. The whole neighborhood was poor. Many of the local dads were alcoholics. Many little kids were sent to stay with grandparents nearby. None of this would be particularly traumatic if all of Myra's friends were living in similar situations. That said, a professor of forensic psychiatry at Cardiff University called Malcolm McCullough wrote that, quote, Myra's relationship with her father brutalized her. She was not only used to violence in the home, but rewarded for it outside. When this happens at a young age, it can distort a person's reaction to such situations for life, end quote.
Another traumatic situation for Myra was when she was 15 years old. She had plans to go swimming with a close friend. She bailed last minute, but her friend was really eager to go swimming and decided he was going to go with or without Myra. He drowned that day, and Myra blamed herself. At this point, she dropped out of high school and converted to Catholicism. Myra started working at a chemical distributor. She quickly noticed and fell hard for Ian Brady. She penned countless obsessive diary entries longing for Brady, despite the fact that she knew full well he had a criminal record. Myra's infatuation escalated over a period of about 6 months before she and Ian ever actually spoke to one another in late July of 1961. It was another several months before they had their first date, and by that time, Myra had become incredibly disillusioned. She was determined to do anything to make him love her and to make him stay with her. In later petitions for parole, Hindley wrote of Brady, quote, "Within months, he had convinced me there was no God at all. He could have told me that the earth was flat, the moon was made of green cheese, and the sun rose in the west. I would have believed him. Such was his power of persuasion," end quote.
Myra, too, cultivated a stylish look and an air of too cool. Clothing in the latest mod styles, bleach blonde hair, bold red lipstick, and a structured haircut all accentuated her dark and severe features. The new couple went on bizarre dates that often started with a visit to the local porno theater to take in an X-rated film and ended with the duo reading lines to each other from Nazi literature while drinking German wine. The two were also pretty fond of the Marquis de Sade, Nietzsche, and Crime and Punishment. They frequented shooting ranges, and Brady built up quite a gun collection. Ian and Myra would fantasize about how they might pull off a bank robbery, often planning out all the details but never actually following through. Brady often spoke about the novel Compulsion by Myra Levin and its film adaptation, which is the story of two young men from well-to-do families who conspired to commit the perfect murder of a 12-year-old boy and escape the death penalty because of their age. Ian Brady fancied himself a bit of a photographer, too. He bought a bunch of darkroom equipment so he could develop his own photos, and he and Myra got to work taking explicit photos of one another. This is something that showed the sway he held over her, as Myra was typically more on the prudish side and was quite shy, so taking explicit photos seemed a little out of character for her. She was a virgin until she met Ian, which she proudly boasted about because, of course, that was what was expected of young women at the time. Men weren't interested in marrying women with any kind of sexual history to speak of.
As dark of a picture as all this information paints of the pair, most people weren't aware of their creepier tendencies and saw them as ordinary neighbors and coworkers. Myra was so well-liked at work that she once lost a paycheck before she had the chance to deposit it. All the girls she worked with pitched in to help her replace the money she lost. By 1963, Ian had moved in with Myra, who still lived with her grandmother in a house on Wardle Brook Avenue in Gordon. Neighbors remembered the couple as quiet but friendly. Their reputation as just a regular couple helped them get away with their crimes for as long as they did. It's said that the two bonded on mutual murderous fantasies and really brought out the worst in one another. This is reminiscent of the story of the Sunset Strip Slayers, who we did an episode on last August. Most speculate that if Doug Clark and Carol Bundy had never met, neither would have gone so far as to commit murder.
The idea that Myra could have been under Ian Brady's spell and was actually just another victim of his manipulation also reminds me of the infamous case of Canadian child killers Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka. It became clear that Karla was just as guilty as Paul when we learned that she offered up her little sister to him as a gift. At the very least, this was Myra's role in the Moores murders. Their victims were way more trusting and willing to hop into a stranger's car when there was a woman present. A young couple out for a drive seems a lot less sinister than one weird dude prowling around on his own. Hindley procured the victims and delivered them to Brady.
The first victim was 16-year-old Pauline Reed, who was a friend of Myra's sister Maureen in high school and had even dated Maureen's husband David Smith for a while. Pauline seemed close enough to approach, but not so close to Myra's family to arouse suspicion. Prior to selecting Pauline, Brady suggested a young girl who was a close family friend of the Hindleys, which Myra felt was too risky. July 12, 1963 was a warm summer evening, and Pauline had pleaded with her mother to let her go to a dance at the British Railway Social Club in suburban Manchester. Her mom didn't want her to make the 1-kilometer walk alone, so she asked around to see if any of the neighbors' daughters would want to go with her, but everyone declined. Pauline insisted that she wouldn't be alone. She knew plenty of friends who were going, and she would catch up with them. Her mom relented, so Pauline got her hair done, put on a pretty pink dress and a brand new pair of stilettos, and headed out the door, never to be seen again. Though she was the first victim, it wasn't clear that her disappearance was associated with the Moores murders until nearly 25 years later. Pauline was considered a missing person for all that time. Hindley sat in a parked van where she spotted Pauline walking down the road alone and asked if she'd mind accompanying her to the Saddleworth Moor, which was about a half-hour drive away, to help search for a missing glove. Myra promised to give Pauline some vital records in exchange for her help, and she agreed and hopped in the van with her. Unbeknownst to Pauline, Brady followed along behind the van on a motorcycle.
At this point, I want to explain the moors to anyone who isn't familiar. The moors are a vast, barren landscape, like rolling fields, but with big mounds throughout that made for great hiding spots. Looking across the moors, there were plenty of obstructions, much different from flat plains where you can see for miles.
When they got to the moors and Ian pulled up behind them, Myra explained to Pauline that he would also help search for the missing glove. The trio walked over to the moor and a bit of a distance away from where the van was parked. Ian Brady sexually assaulted Pauline and then slit her throat. Her body was buried in a 1-meter deep grave.
On November 23, 1963, Brady and Hindley attacked their next victim, 12-year-old John Kilbride. John lived in Ashton-under-Lyne with his parents and 6 siblings. He liked to help out at the local market to earn some extra pocket change, which is where he was when he was abducted. Myra asked John to help her load some boxes into her car, where Ian sat at the wheel. They told the boy they would give him a ride home afterwards, but instead, they drove to the moors. At the moors, Ian raped John and tried to slit his throat with a 6-inch serrated blade. And when that didn't work, he strangled the child with a shoelace. His body was also buried in a shallow grave. John's mother, Sheila, set the table for her missing son every day for 2 years until his body was found. She never got over it. John's brother, Terry Kilbride, has said, quote, "She always used to be singing when she was cooking or ironing, but it just stopped. Everything died."
On June 16, 1964, Keith Bennett disappeared while making the short walk from his parents' house to his grandmother's house in Chorlton on Medlock. The details of Keith's murder remain a mystery because despite the fact that Hindley and Brady confessed to killing him, his body has never been found. The killers were even permitted to leave prison to visit the moors along with the police at this point in order to point out the spot where Keith's body was buried. When they arrived, it seemed their memories were a bit foggy, and they couldn't find the grave after all. Keith's mother, Winnie Johnston, spent the rest of her life searching for him, even digging around the moors alone with just a shovel. After Winnie died in 2012, a memorial plaque was placed overlooking Saddleworth Moor reading, "To Winnie and Keith, may you both rest in peace. Keith will come home."
On Boxing Day 1964, the killers abducted their youngest victim, 10-year-old Leslie Ann Downey. There was a fair that day not far from the Downey family home in Manchester, and Leslie Ann and her older brother Terry planned to go together. Terry was feeling awful, sniffling and sneezing, and he told Leslie Ann that when he started to feel a bit better, they could go to the fair. But throughout the day, he just felt worse and worse, until finally he said there was no way he could make it to the fair. Leslie Ann really wanted to go, and her mom didn't want to let her down, so she asked some neighbors to take her along with them. But they must have gotten separated, because when Myra Hindley found her, Leslie Ann was alone. Myra was carrying some grocery bags and deliberately dropped some items out of the bag, enticing Leslie Ann to pick them up and hand them to her. When she did, Myra suggested the girl help carry groceries to the car. Leslie Ann was lured all the way to the house where Myra and Ian lived with Granny Maybury and was ultimately raped, murdered, and buried in a shallow grave on the moors like all the others.
When we spoke of how all this went on, unbeknownst to any of the neighbors, those neighbors we mentioned included Myra's sister Maureen and her husband David Smith, who lived just a few doors down and across the street from where Brady and Hindley lived. Myra was really close with her younger sister, which is why they chose to live so close. The two couples would hang out a whole lot, according to David Smith. They would all go out for drinks. They would hang out at home listening to recordings and have drinks, eat at nearby restaurants and have drinks. It was a pretty drunken time. Ian Brady did a lot of puffing his chest out, trying to look cool, and David ate it up. David was a teenager at the time. He had gotten Maureen pregnant at 15 and married her at 16. David was another pretty stylish dude, and it seems the guys thought they had a lot in common until all this murder stuff came out. It was clear Ian Brady was a rough and tumble sort of guy and that he had a criminal history, but prior to learning he was a murderer, those details seemed to impress his friend. David had a criminal history as well, and the two bonded over it. Ian would take David along to the shooting range too and actually taught him to shoot. In retrospect, David realized he'd been hanging out with a bad guy. The Nazi literature he was always reading, for example, wasn't just for show. But again, as a teen, David didn't see things that way. Ian's perspective was a bit askew too. He seemed to see in David Smith a potential murderous protege. Looking back at the details of their friendship, it seemed like Ian had been grooming David.
On October 6, 1965, Brady and Hindley drove to Manchester Central Railway Station to scope out potential victims. Myra waited in the car while Brady met 17-year-old Edward Evans. They walked back to the car together, and Ian introduced Myra as his sister. It was later revealed that the reason they had selected Edward was that Brady felt they would be more likely to come under suspicion if they abducted another young child. Seeing the public and media reactions to the disappearances and murders of their earlier victims, Brady realized that a young victim created a big sensation. He felt that with an older teenager, the parents and police would probably just assume he had run away, and that would be the end of it. Edward was a lonely teen with no friends, and probably was delighted that a cool guy like Brady was interested in talking to and hanging out with him. Brady claimed to have invited him home to share a bottle of wine and have a sexual encounter. Edward willingly got into the car, and when they got to the house, he and Ian were relaxing in the living room while Myra went down the road to fetch David Smith.
P.S. I think you should change your name to Angelina.
I was wondering if you had noticed that.
I kind of love it.
I just noticed it and was like, interesting typo.
It's kind of like moon goddessy.
Yeah, that's a moon angel. That's me.
I love it. It's not clear what David thought was going down that evening, but Myra told him to wait outside until he saw the signal, a flashing light, and then to come and knock on the door. He followed her instructions, and when he knocked on the door, Ian answered, asking David if he had come for the miniature wine bottles, and David said yes. So then Ian led David into the kitchen and left him there while he went into the living room, saying he would grab those wine bottles. Myra stood in the kitchen with David. I'm going to read what David told the police happened next. Quote, I waited about a minute or two, then suddenly I heard a hell of a scream. It sounded like a woman, really high-pitched. Then the screams carried on, one after another, really loud. Then I heard Myra shout, Dave, help him, very loud. When I ran in, I just stood inside the living room and I saw a young lad. He was lying with his head and shoulders on the couch and his legs were on the floor. He was facing upwards. Ian was standing over him, facing him, with his legs on either side of the young lad's legs. The lad was still screaming. Ian had a hatchet in his hand. He was holding it above his head, and he hit the lad on the side of his head with the hatchet. I heard the blow. It was a terrible, hard blow. It sounded horrible.
Edward Evans was then strangled with an electrical cord. Having seen a number of shows and read a number of publications about this situation, it's not really clear who did what after Ian hit the boy with a hatchet. Maybe Ian struck the boy a few more times while David did the strangling. Maybe Ian did the strangling and David only got involved in moving the body. Maybe Myra had a hand in the murder too. Whatever the situation, David Smith says that shit got real as soon as the attack on Edward Evans began. Like he suddenly sobered up and realized who he was dealing with in Brady and Hindley, and that he had to think on his feet in order to escape the situation alive. He couldn't tell whether Brady wanted to blackmail him, thinking that by turning David into an accomplice, he wouldn't be able to go to the police. Or maybe they wanted to pin the whole thing on David, which did cross their minds a few times, and David didn't know the half of what they might be trying to frame him for. It's not clear whether David even considered the idea that Ian might be trying to indoctrinate him into their murder gang, but again, as far as David knew at this point, there had only been one murder, the murder of Edward Evans. At some point in the scuffle, Brady had sprained his ankle, and so he enlisted Smith's help in moving the body, which they wrapped in a plastic shower curtain and placed in the spare bedroom. David Smith knew he had to be a yes man at that moment, doing anything Brady or Hindley asked of him in order to survive. So he helped move the body, and he stayed to hang out for a couple of hours afterwards, drinking tea in the living room. As soon as the tension settled, and David felt it wouldn't be suspicious of him to leave, he told Myra and Ian that he should go home to bed. He agreed to come back the next morning with his baby's carriage to help move the body. Around 3 a.m., David Smith went home and immediately vomited. Directly after that, he went to his wife Maureen, Myra's sister, and told her he had just witnessed a murder. Maureen had no idea anything sinister had been going on, but she wasn't interested in being an accomplice either, so they decided to report the murder to the police.
David said he tried to lay low at home for a while too, knowing that if Ian or Myra saw him leaving the house right after he went home to bed, they would kill him too. He waited until he heard the morning buzz out in the streets of people getting up and getting ready for work and newspapers being delivered. Once they felt like they could slip out into the streets unnoticed, David and Maureen went out together with their baby in its carriage. They walked down the road to the nearest payphone booth where David phoned the police. He didn't want to say what was going on, still so worried about being apprehended by Brady and Hindley, so he just told police that he had something to report and they'd better come and pick him up from the phone booth as soon as possible. The police picked up David, Maureen, and the baby and brought them to the station. David reported the murder and noted that the body was probably still in a spare bedroom if they wanted to see proof. Police Superintendent Bob Talbot of the Stalybridge Police Department and a detective sergeant went to the house on Whortlebrook Avenue, grabbing a uniform and some milk bottles from a milk delivery man on the way over. They posed as milkmen, knocked on the back door, and when Myra answered, asked her if her husband was home. Myra denied having a husband and denied that there was a man in the house at all. Talbot then identified himself and Myra let him in to talk to Ian, who was on the couch writing a letter to his employer about his hurt ankle. The cops told the couple that they were investigating an act of violence involving guns that was reported to have taken place the previous evening. Hindley and Brady said they weren't aware of anything like that and no violence had taken place at their house. The cops then asked to see the spare room, which was locked, and Myra told them the keys were at her workplace. When they offered to drive there and get it, Brady told Hindley to just hand it over. After seeing the body, the police arrested Ian Brady, who remarked, "Eddie and I had a row and the situation got out of hand." Ian Brady and Myra Hindley seemed to have made a pact to not say anything about their crimes if they were ever interrogated. And without any further information, the police didn't realize how big this case was. Only Ian was arrested, but Myra insisted on going along to the police station. Refusing to take any kind of statement about the murder, insisting it was an accident, Myra was released. With Brady in custody, Hindley was free to hide and destroy the evidence. She burned some letters with bank robbery plans within. She shredded some documents. She packed up suitcases full of stuff she didn't want to leave lying around the house and brought those suitcases to the train station, locking them inside a locker. On October 11th, she was finally arrested and charged as an accessory to murder, but 4 days of freedom to get rid of evidence is a long time.
Police searched the home on Whortlebrook Avenue and found a notebook inside labeled John Kilbride. They then began to suspect that Ian Brady had been responsible for additional murders. They searched so thoroughly as to find a claim ticket for some luggage left at Manchester Central Railway Station inside of Myra's prayer book. A search of the station uncovered luggage containing all sorts of trophies and evidence. There was wigs, weird porn, notes, photographs, and negatives, including 9 pornographic photographs of Leslie Ann Downey naked with a scarf tied around her mouth. There were several photographs taken of Brady and Hindley posing on the moors, and a bunch of rather innocuous-looking landscape shots. There was also a 16-minute audio tape of a young child who identified herself as Leslie Ann Weston being tortured.
Police interviewing neighbors talked to a 12-year-old girl who said she was friends with Ian Brady and Myra Hindley. Patricia Hodges said the couple would often drive her to the moors where they would walk around and hang out and play with Myra's dog, Puppet. Allegedly, Patricia Hodges was the girl who Myra refused to kill, telling Ian that the girl was too close to her family for them to get away with it. Patricia told the police that she could easily point out a few of the couple's favorite spots on the moors. After Patricia pointed out a spot on Saddleworth Moor, police searched the area and pretty quickly turned up a human femur bone on October 16th. Further digging uncovered an entire body buried in the shallow grave. Initially, they thought they had found John Kilbride's body, but the following day, the body was identified as Leslie Ann Downey when her mother recognized the clothing she had last been wearing.
Some incredibly detail-oriented investigators used the landscape photos of the moors found in the suitcases to track down some more potential grave sites. On October 21st, they found John Kilbride's badly decomposed body, which also had to be identified by the clothing he'd been wearing when he died. In a television series about the Moors murders case, a team of police and dozens of volunteers are shown combing the moors in search of additional bodies. You can see them carrying out a bizarre search method in which each person has a long pointed stick that they would plunge repeatedly into the ground, and then they pull the stick out and smell it to see if the area they had poked might contain a dead body and might be worth digging up. I wondered why they didn't employ cadaver dogs, and a quick Google search informed that while the first cadaver dogs were used in the UK during the 19th century, the practice never really caught on, and to this day, investigators rarely rely on cadaver dogs to aid in searches of missing and possibly murdered persons.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
To aid in dating the photographs on the moors of Myra and her dog Puppet, detectives enlisted the help of a veterinary surgeon to examine the dog and determine his exact age. This required putting the dog under anesthetic, and the dog did not survive the procedure. Myra was furious, and detectives say this was one of the very few times they saw anything elicit an emotional response in her. The police suspected Brady and Hindley were responsible for additional murders of missing children and teens in the area. The search of the moors was called off in November due to frozen weather. Listening to the recording of Leslie Ann Downey that was found in the suitcase, Myra Hindley's voice is clearly audible, telling the child what to do and actively participating in her torture. Brady claimed that after the recording was made, Leslie Ann was taken out of the home alive by two men. He claimed those two men also brought her over to the house in the first place and denied having abducted the child. Nonetheless, with 3 bodies and plenty of evidence, it was now clear that the duo were serial killers.
On December 2nd, Ian Brady was charged with the murders of John Kilbride, Leslie Ann Downey, and Edward Evans. Myra Hindley was charged with the murders of Leslie Ann Downey and Edward Evans and being an accessory to the murder of John Kilbride. At a hearing on December 6th, a charge was added to Myra's record for harboring Ian Brady with the knowledge that he had killed John Kilbride. The trial was an incredible sensation, and not just because serial killers were virtually unheard of at that time in the UK. They had also just done away with the death penalty a few short weeks beforehand, so Brady and Hindley were the first major criminals to be convicted of multiple murders and live to tell the tale. Both killers received an unprecedented sentence of life in prison, which actually meant life in prison, to live out the rest of their days in jail and never be released until they were dead. We mentioned the possibility of the murders being pinned on David Smith, and despite the fact that he was the prosecution's star witness and never officially came under suspicion by the law, he suffered as a result of this sensational story that he had inadvertently become a part of.
David Smith and Maureen Hindley were hounded by the police and press and chased out of their home on Gordon. David described being beaten by strangers in the street and seeing women spit at his baby son. David couldn't find work anywhere. Random bricks would come flying through the family's windows. Ultimately, it put so much strain on their marriage that David and Maureen divorced. The family was threatened by a gang, and in response, David Smith physically attacked its leader, which earned him a short stint in prison in 1969. His time in prison sparked a nervous breakdown and an inspiration to turn his life around. David moved to Galway, Ireland, and took a second wife, Mary.
At the time of the Moors murders trial, some survivors came out of the woodwork. In 1963, 7-year-old Tommy Radigan was lured to the house on Wartleburg Avenue when Myra Hindley gave him a coy smile and asked him if he was hungry, inviting him over for bread and jam. Once at the house, Tommy noticed the mood shift, and he felt he was in danger. He jumped out the window and ran as Myra shouted, "The little shit's getting away." David Gray was 10 years old when Hindley and Brady pulled up beside him in their car and told him to get in, claiming they were police officers. David asked them to show him a warrant, and Brady replied, "You watch too much telly, son." Instead of getting in the car, David ran inside a nearby shop. Later, when news of the murders came to light, David read about his would-be captors in the paper. Quote, As I opened the paper up, I realized what they wanted to do to me. When I picked that paper up, my childhood ended.
The story of the Moors murderers got only weirder as the two served their sentences. Ian Brady leaned on his too cool persona, loving the attention he earned and the name he had made for himself as a dark celebrity. He likened himself to some kind of Marlon Brando character. He was a gangster in his mind. Myra, for a while, just seemed to wait for Brady's cues. She would say nothing until he piped up with new confessions. When Brady confessed to the murders of Keith Bennett and Pauline Reed, Myra did too. To quote the Smiths song, "Suffer Little Children," which was written about the case, Myra's admissions went something like this: "Wherever he has gone, I have gone. Whatever he has done, I have done." Hindley and Brady exchanged letters in prison until 1971, when Myra ended the relationship.
Myra, too, was an actor. In prison, she acted meek, boring, sensitive, manipulated. And Myra's friends ate it up, even when the public and the media weren't so convinced. One particular prison friendship left an indelible mark on the historic case of the Moors murders, and that was Myra Hindley's friendship with Janie Jones. For those of you who aren't familiar, Janie Jones began as a cabaret artist in London in the late 1950s. In the 60s, she was a British pop star. Her biggest hit was Witch's Brew in 1966. In 1964, she made waves when she showed up to the premiere for the film London in the Raw wearing a topless dress. Throughout her fame, Jones was known for throwing some pretty wild sex parties, which put her under the scrutiny of the law. In 1974, Janie Jones was sentenced to 7 years in prison for operating a prostitution ring, but she only served 3 years. During those 3 years, Hindley and Jones grew incredibly close as Janie fell under Myra's spell. After she was released from prison, Janie Jones championed for the cause of granting Myra Hindley's appeal for parole. She used her celebrity to make television appearances in which she would insist that Myra had been manipulated in the first place and that she was now a reformed woman who would never in a million years commit offenses like the Moors murders. Janie and Myra kept in touch, writing letters to one another while Myra remained in prison.
In 1986, Myra made her official confession, and a horrified Janie Jones immediately cut off contact with Myra, feeling manipulated herself. Deeply enraged by Hindley's lies and feeling betrayed, Janie Jones shifted into citizen detective mode and decided to begin exchanging letters with Ian Brady, hoping to round out the story. It was all a big play. Hindley's letters to Jones, Brady's letters to Jones, all of the above clearly demonstrated the fiend's carefully cultivated personas and underlined exactly how manipulative both parties were. Myra had actually written an entire unpublished autobiography, which she had sent to Janie Jones in the mail. Myra leaned into her victim complex, asserting that she would never forgive David Smith for betraying her and had cut off all ties with her sister Maureen. At one point, Myra had been physically attacked in prison, and she couldn't seem to wrap her head around why this violent bitch would do such a thing to poor Myra Hindley. It was like hanging out with a sadistic Nazi, and participating in the Moors murders were nothing more than a few controversial life choices. And even if her friends should disagree with those life choices, they should still have stood by her, or at the very least, kept her secrets. She acted as if she were entitled to the unconditional love and support of her family, friends, and neighbors. And when they didn't deliver, she felt scorned. All this completely disregarded the fact that murder is a criminal act and the killer's victims were real human beings with friends and family of their own who cared about them.
Ian Brady's letters were a carefully curated account of his entire life story, with very specific parts of his life deliberately held back. He happily boasted his involvement in the murders and also provided an array of fictitious details from his childhood and upbringing. Brady knew he wasn't just writing to Janie Jones. He knew the letters would be shared and would probably hit the papers, and he wanted to solidify his rock star status. He felt like a serial killer idol. He pretended to have some idyllic childhood very far from the truth, likely so he could assert that he became a killer of his own volition and not as a result of any trauma he had endured. Brady expressed that he felt that daring to take a life, not having such a fearful respect for mortality as most people do, elevated him above everyone else as stronger and more powerful and special. Ian Brady was happy to protect his lover in the face of media and legal scrutiny until the day that she claimed to have been a pawn in Brady's project. Ian wanted to make it clear that they were very much in this together as an equal partnership. He shared that Hindley had insisted on killing Leslie Ann Downey herself, strangling the child with a length of silk cord. He claimed that the two bonded over their shared criminal experiences and that each subsequent homicide brought them closer together. Each murder felt like a marriage ceremony, further uniting the deadly duo. Brady claimed David Smith had more involvement than he let on, but that he knew David was a, quote, weak link and possibly a rat weeks before the murder of Edward Evans. He claimed that he and Myra had discussed plotting the murders of her sister and brother-in-law at one point in time, but ultimately decided against it. It's impossible to tell how much of the content of the letters shared with Janie Jones is factual and how much was fabricated. However, the lot of letters were closely examined by forensic psychologists in an attempt to separate fact from fiction and to better understand the killer's personalities.
In Myra's letters, deliberately boring by comparison, she comes off as almost more manipulative than Ian. His more obvious and direct persona couldn't be confused with that of an innocent victim. Myra never stopped trying to twist the public's picture of her and worked tirelessly to make all the right friends and convince them of her innocence. When Myra took a lover in prison, it was none other than prison warden and former nun Patricia Cairns. Once again, she claimed to convert to Catholicism. She did not set her sights on the weakest link in the chain. She targeted the most powerful and popular people she could in order to gain maximum control over the situation. Myra appealed to the governor of the prison, who she manipulated into taking her on long walks outside of the prison grounds, much to the public's dismay. Hindley shared her prison escape plans with Patricia Cairns, who tried to facilitate them. Framed as a romantic fantasy, Hindley told Cairns that they could run away to Germany together and join a convent. When they attempted to execute this plan, they were found out, and Patricia Cairns was sentenced to 6 years in prison. Janie Jones had also kept in touch with Patricia after her release, and she says she tried to warn her about Myra, that there was no way she actually loved Patricia, that she was only playing the game. But it was no use because Tricia was head over heels in love and completely under Myra's spell.
In 1985, Ian Brady was moved to a psychiatric facility and diagnosed as a psychopath and a paranoid schizophrenic. Brady many times divulged his desire to die while in custody. In 1993, Janie Jones wrote an autobiography titled The Devil and Miss Jones, The Twisted Mind of Myra Hindley. In conversation with Jones, Cairns explained that Hindley had an impressive method of self-preservation and compartmentalization. She had a, quote, little Buddhist box in the back of her mind, inside of which she would put all of the bad things that happened in her life and then lock the box. In retrospect, this comes off as a romanticized description of a sociopath.
In 2001, Brady wrote The Gates of Janus, which was published by the U.S. underground publisher Feral House. The book, Brady's analysis of serial murder and specific serial killers, sparked outrage when announced in the UK. In the book, Brady recounted his friendship with the teacup poisoner Graham Young, who shared Brady's admiration for Nazi Germany. Right before Myra Hindley's death, she released a series of letters describing her alleged friendship with Ian Brady. She said when they were first dating, she would sometimes wake up and find her boyfriend had drugged her. She described threats, beatings that woke her grandmother in the night, and feeling like she could never stand up to Ian Brady or she would be murdered herself. In one alleged conversation after the abduction of Pauline Reed, Ian told Myra that if she showed any sign of backing out, she would wind up in a grave right beside Pauline, and Myra responded, "I know."
Neither David Smith nor Janie Jones bought any of the so-called revelations released by Myra Hindley on her deathbed. As David Smith put it, Hindley's mugshot perfectly depicts the Myra he knew. Cold, stone-faced, and defiant. Bold and unafraid. No fear in her empty eyes. After being hospitalized with angina in 1999 and suffering a brain aneurysm, 60-year-old Myra Hindley, a lifelong chain smoker, died at West Suffolk Hospital of bronchial pneumonia in 2002. 20 local undertakers refused to handle her cremation. 4 months later, her ashes were scattered by her ex-partner, Patricia Cairns, less than 10 miles from Saddleworth Moor in Stalybridge Country Park. The Manchester Evening News reported on possible fears that this would result in visitors choosing to vandalize the park or avoid it altogether.
In 2011, 45 years after the crimes, David Smith published a memoir entitled Witness, with a foreword by Keith Bennett's father, Alan. In 2012, Smith lost a battle with cancer and passed away. Alan Bennett remarked that he was very sad to learn of Smith's death, and he was so dedicated to helping uncover Keith's body and bring some closure to the family and the case on the whole. He always said to me that what he went through was nothing compared to what we and the other victims' families did, said Bennett. Smith's widow, Mary, said, he was an absolute inspiration to everyone in his family. He has given us so much strength to deal with things. There are a million words I would like to say about him, but the main thing is just that we all love him so much.
Also in 2012, Brady applied to be returned to prison, reiterating his desire to starve himself to death. This application was rejected. On May 15, 2017, Ian Brady died of restrictive pulmonary disease at Ashworth Hospital. A coroner's inquest found that he died of natural causes and that his hunger strike had not been a contributing factor. Brady had refused food and fluids for more than 48 hours on various occasions, causing him to be fitted with a nasogastric tube, although his inquest noted that his body mass index was not a cause for concern. He was cremated and his ashes were disposed of at sea during the night, under strict rules that no music nor ceremony of any type would be permitted out of respect for his victims' families. That's the Morris murders.
Wow. Yeah, I feel like I watched a documentary about this on Netflix ages ago, but it's worse than I remembered.
Yeah.
Terrible.
There's just so much to it. I think like every new thing that I found to read or watch about it, I was like, what? How did these other programs not talk about that? And like,
Right.
the plot kept thickening, you know?
Right.
I understand why it's such a prolific, memorable case in British history for sure.
Absolutely. So messed up.
So you watching anything true crimey or spooky lately?
Yeah, I have watched a couple things. I did watch the first few episodes of the second season of Flight Attendant.
Nice.
And it's definitely not the same as the first season. Like it's,
not
like
up to par.
Like I'm entertained and I'm going to keep watching, but it's not nearly as engaging as the plot of the first one. Like you can tell that like they gave it all they had in the first season, and now they're like,
maybe
how do we keep this going?
That it would be renewed.
Yeah,
just like,
I mean, I'm sure that they did because it was so popular, but it's like their next step wasn't quite clear to them. I feel like
they lost some momentum.
Yeah, but it's still good. Like I don't mean to like bash it or whatever, but I'll definitely keep watching that. And then also, there's a new show with, I think her name's Elizabeth Moss from Mad Men.
Oh, yeah.
Is that who that is? Yeah. She's in a show, Shining Girls, and it's based on a book that I read probably about 10 years ago. It's when I was living in Austin, Texas. And have you ever read this?
I haven't, but I've added it to my list. I know this because I have heard about it a little bit. And how does the show measure up?
The book is just wonderful. It's like, it's got to be one of my favorite kind of like serial killer thriller kinds of things I've ever read. Like there's like time hopping and time travel and like weird like mysteries and whatever. Like there's just like so many elements to it. Like you get it all, like serial killers and like anything you want is in this book.
Amazing.
And I really loved it. And the show is good so far. I'm one episode in. I was actually just watching it right before this.
Oh.
And my memories of the book are a little bit vague because it's been so long since I've read it that I definitely don't remember exactly how it's going to go. But Elizabeth Moss is just such an amazing actress.
Right.
Aside from the whole Scientology nonsense,
whatever,
but she's very talented. Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that. Damn.
Yeah, but she's just so great. And she's so good in Mad Men, which is one of my favorites.
Yeah.
So she's really good. And the guy that plays the serial killer, I swear, is like exactly how I imagined him reading the book. Like, I was like, wait, did they already make this before? Like, have I seen this? Like, how do I know this guy? It's like, it's exactly how I envisioned him.
Oh, that's nice. It's always good when they do that.
Yeah, good casting. So that's it. That's what I've been watching. How about you?
Well, I had previously talked about a show on here called Undone, where I had devoured the first season pretty quickly, starring Rosa Salazar. And this is like a rotoscope animation style. And this also is about time travel a whole bunch. But in the first season, it's kind of up in the air whether she's experiencing mental illness or whether she's experiencing time travel. So that's pretty much where we end up. This season, it becomes a little more clear what exactly is going on. And it's so, so good. I watched it all in one day and I couldn't sleep. I was just like, I need to know what's happening. So very super good. Recommend that to everyone. I'm sure there's going to be a season 3 based on how it ended off. Again, this show has everything, criminal stuff, random deaths, time travels, redoing stuff, and just playing with the idea of like, what kind of tragedy do we really wish we had a do-over on, and what kind should we probably just learn to cope with, because there's a limit. Like if you're able to go back and change everything, then where do you stop? So loved that, recommend that. I also started watching the show that I mentioned called The Girl from Plainville, which is about Michelle Carter and starring Elle Fanning. Elle Fanning is really good in this role. And I think she was probably hired based on her like really good sort of fake crying, which like, I don't know. It's like she plays a good person pretending not to be acting, but actually is secretly acting. And like, it's really, I love that.
Layers of complexity there. I like it.
And it's getting incredibly creepy. Like most people, I mean, I've read the news on the story, but I didn't put a lot of thought into just what Michelle was like as a person on the whole, or what kind of personality would lead to her wanting to do something like this. And just learning more about her personality and who she was is just disturbing, but enlightening. And recommend that too. And then I watched a sort of comedic thriller called Come to Daddy, which stars Elijah Wood. And it was pretty predictable, but still cool and, very entertaining. So
that sounds really good. I like the idea of a comedic thriller.
Yeah, me too. It was, it's just got some dark quips in there. And it's like, I was laughing a lot. I was watching with a friend who was, I think, just hanging in the balance, waiting to see how scared or thrilled she was going to be. And me, I was just laughing away like a weirdo. So
I love it.
Yeah. So that was good. But that's all I got this week.
Nice.
Well, I guess that's enough murder for 1 week. If you disagree and could stand more murder than this one show can contain, you can always find us on the OG MurderMurder.news for the latest breaking true crime news all week long.
You can also find us on Instagram at MurderMurder News, on Twitter at Murder News, on TikTok at MurderMurder News, and of course on Facebook. You can find us just by searching for MurderMurder News.
And while you're on Facebook searching for MurderMurder News, you'll also see our group pop up. You'll want to join us there if you'd like to be more active in the MMN community, and you'll definitely want to be a member of that group if you want in on our virtual book club. We're just getting started on our next selection, Thursday Murder Club by Richard Osman. We'll meet to discuss the book on Zoom on the last Sunday of the month, and we hope to see some new faces there.
Don't forget to leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts to help new fans find the show, and make sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform so you never miss an episode.
Thanks for listening. Have a good week.
Bye, friends.
Bye.